There is no denying it costs an arm and a leg to live in New York City. So it's no surprise that a report finds 1 in 3 New Yorkers spends more than half their income on rent.
Yeah, this comes as the number of affordable apartments has gone down by double digits across the 5 boroughs.
So in a city with nowhere affordable to live, nowhere to buy affordable groceries, and not enough jobs paying a living wage, how do the 8 million New Yorkers who live here survive if living paycheck to paycheck is no longer an option? Well, sadly, some people are going into debt to keep a roof over their heads. But the problem is that could spell financial disaster for all of us.
50% is a high percentage.
The cost of renting in New York is outpacing the income of New Yorkers so dramatically that one group is ringing the alarm.
All my friends have like multiple jobs, multiple side gigs.
Food, medical services.
It's pretty hard to even move out and look for a place on your own. Like, everybody has to live with roommates.
Well, now a new poll finds as more New Yorkers struggle with rising food prices, they are cutting back on healthy food.
I mean, you want to eat healthy, but the economy is not allowing for that.
A new survey shows 85% of New Yorkers say the cost of food is rising faster than their income, and nearly half of New Yorkers say it's much harder to afford groceries now.
The number of buy now, pay later loans increased nearly 1,100%. That rapid growth has some analysts concerned because where there are loans, there's debt. But exactly how much debt is still unclear.
With renters squeezed so tightly, there is yet another cost.
It also is a detriment to the city's overall economic stability because people don't have money to spend on anything but housing.
And it doesn't matter if they make $30,000 or $100,000. This is something felt by New Yorkers of all incomes.
Is moving to New York worth it? That's the question many people are now asking. But what nobody's talking about is that moving here, that's one thing. Remaining here for any length of time, that's completely different. Which is why so many people are now digging themselves a financial hole by borrowing money. A sad reality many middle-income families who once felt prosperous in the Empire State are now being faced with. And that's because this is now officially the least affordable place you could possibly live in America, with homes costing millions of dollars to own and thousands of dollars to rent, even though they are some of the smallest apartments anywhere on the planet. But the cost of living, that's just the first problem facing most people, because if you've got a cushy job and a big skyscraper making over $100,000, that might not matter to you so much. However, New York's recent job growth has been slanted towards the lower end of the economic ladder, with lots of openings for positions at businesses and with the government, which sadly don't pay people enough money to actually live here in any meaningful capacity. Especially when the costs of housing aren't the only problem people are facing, it's the prices of everything that are rising. And grocery store milk is so expensive, it's gonna make your eyes pop out of your head. However, the real reason we're now seeing families dig themselves into financial pits they cannot escape from is because New York's affordability crisis has gone on for way too long. So long, in fact, that people are either skipping their bills entirely or turning to things like buy now, pay later that are a short-term fix for a long-term problem. And it's all because the city we live in, which claims to be looking out for the little guy, actually isn't. And the problems we're talking about here are so deep that when individuals take on extra debt just to try and stay in the city, it could affect all of us in ways nobody's ready to imagine. Okay, this might be a small place, but it's also the cheapest 3-bedroom in town, and the rent is $59.95 a month, so about $2,000 per person. And to live here, each roommate's gonna have to be making $80,000 a year. But you know what's gonna happen here? The person that rents this, they're gonna be somebody that can likely barely afford to rent it as is. Now, the hope is that income goes up, but if incomes don't rise that fast, whoever comes in could be in some sort of a trap, so you have to really be careful. And either way, this is a lot of money for most people, many of whom are essentially living paycheck to paycheck. And now some are even going into debt to afford regular weekly expenses, which is a massive trap. bad idea. Because having to pay off debts for things you need on a regular weekly basis is just gonna dig you into a financial hole, which is gonna be so tough to get out of, some people might find themselves trapped financially in a place they can't afford. And as you're about to see, that could end up spelling disaster, not just for you, but also for the city's entire economy.
50% is a high percentage.
The cost of renting in New York is outpacing the income of New Yorkers so dramatically that one group is ringing the alarm, finding 1 in 3 people in the city are paying more than half their income to rent. The data, bad, but not a surprise to...
So it's important to understand that the landlord, he's not gonna rent you this apartment if he doesn't think that you can afford it. But 1 out of every 3 New Yorkers is already spending half their income in rent. And the only way that's possible is if people move into places they can afford at first, but then their income just doesn't keep pace with the rent increases. And since in New York, you don't get re-qualified from year to year to stay in the place most of the time, people end up finding themselves imprisoned financially in a small apartment. And that's because, according to the federal government, if you spend more than 30% of your income on rent, you're what is considered rent burdened. And people who are rent burdened tend to have issues with sudden expenses when they come up. Maybe like a sudden medical expense or a car repair. Hopefully you don't have a car if you're trying to live in a New York apartment, but you get the idea. If something comes up and it's above what you budgeted for and you don't have the money for the budget you already have, that could be bad.
A financial struggle that leads to some tough decisions, passing up on essentials like food, healthcare, and education.
Pretty hard to even move out and look for a place on your own. Like, everybody has to live with roommates.
CSSNY says with renters
So privacy, that's one of the sacrifices many people are making. There's nothing wrong with living with roommates, and it makes sense that people are willing to give up having the privacy of a 1-bedroom that's $5,000 when a place like this is $59.95. You could save a lot of money, but the dream of ever living on your own might be unattainable for a lot of people. But it's even more than that, because you just heard how grocery bills, medical bills, pretty much anything and everything is way more expensive than it used to be. And for that reason, you've now got people taking on extra forms of employment, which they need to continue living in New York. And since the jobs aren't paying enough and people are working second and sometimes even third jobs if they're incorporating gig work along with like a salaried position, this is gonna have effects on our city that experts and city leaders have missed, and they're not good effects.
There is yet another cost.
It also is a detriment to the city's overall economic stability because people don't have money to spend on anything but housing.
The good news is that the experts say there is a clear solution to this, and that is the creation of affordable housing. But the bad news is
Okay. Yeah, we keep hearing about that. Affordable housing. But it's not gonna happen. If it were to happen, places would be more affordable. This would have happened a long time ago. But the fact that there's no affordable housing leads us to a new crisis. And that crisis is that if you're spending everything you have on rent, you really have no money left for the rest of the economy. So all of the businesses, all of the things here that are required for the city to function also start suffering. And if everyone's trying to survive in the gig economy, but people stop ordering from restaurants and start cooking all their meals at home, what do you think's gonna happen to all those local restaurants? They're gonna stop getting orders, they're gonna shut down. And the same thing goes for every other type of employment that we've got here. If you work at like a clothing store, but people are cutting back spending on things like clothing, shoes, and whatnot, those items are gonna stay on the shelf. Your job isn't really gonna have a purpose because there aren't any customers, but you need that job to stay in your apartment like this. It's a slippery slope of a hamster wheel. These are the consequences that we're in because these are the only apartments that the city's gonna allow us to have, the ones that we already have. But that brings us to the next set of major consequences that we're looking at here. One of those is crime. You've got people committing crime. They steal from stores, resell those items online, boom, that's a job, and there's customers because your items are cheaper than your competitors because all your items are stolen. But that's not all. Because the law abiding, they're not gonna go and do something like that. No, they're gonna do the right thing. They're gonna try to pay everything in an honest way. And because our economy isn't really doing that great, companies have come up with creative ways to help us spend money that we don't have. Think credit cards, but worse. Talking about these buy now, pay later schemes. Yes, these types of programs might help you buy supplies for your bathroom, like toothpaste, paper towel, toilet paper, and they're helpful to people who need them to try and stay ahead of a rising cost curve with their rent that's higher than their income. But as you're about to see, these new types of micro-lending schemes might be doing more harm than good. However, many people living in tiny apartments right now are relying on them, and so are the businesses that need to sell to people who don't have the money to buy the products. And these new programs, they're growing so rapidly that they're creating a new type of debt crisis that the country's never seen before. And experts are saying this could be so bad it could cause the entire economy to collapse. So as you can see here, this store shutting down, sales pretty much all over the place. Companies aren't getting as much money from us as they used to because we don't have it. But they've got a sneaky way of helping us spend more, especially when we shop online. That might seem harmless at first, but these schemes could be the next big problem to hit America.
You've probably seen the option at checkout to split a purchase into separate interest-free installments. The number of buy now, pay later loans increased nearly 1,100% between 2019 and 2021. That rapid growth has some analysts concerned because where there are loans, there's debt. But exactly how much debt is still unclear.
So now you've got experts referring to this new wave of potential subprime loans as phantom debt, because the problem is we don't really know how much of it's even out there. And unlike credit card debt you might take on when you spend for leisure or you spend on necessities, there's really no record of it. But even though now we're seeing people in high-cost cities and states relying on buy now, pay later to make it through every single month, every single week, it's important to understand that these schemes, they started back in 2019. And at first, they weren't such a big deal. In fact, they made it easier for people to make a very expensive one-time purchase and pay it off over the next several weeks. Not a big problem, especially when the economy's fine and people feel like they have plenty of money to spend. But times have changed because now those high-value purchases, those are taking place at the grocery store. Those are taking place when people buy necessities. And going into debt just to survive when the costs around you are rising faster than your income, that is 100% a financial trap, and many people are getting stuck in it. And that's because moving also isn't cheap. That costs thousands of dollars. And if you're in a place like New York, which also costs thousands of dollars for you to stay in, and you run out of money completely, it might not be possible for you to move, and you might have to take on debt just to stay. That sounds awful, but there's another problem with these loans. And that's because as people take on more and more debt, the economy gets on shakier and shakier ground. And the more people that take on these loans, whether it's for expensive stuff they shouldn't buy or for things that are important that they should buy, the higher the number of people who will potentially default on them. And as more and more cities and states become like New York, just completely unaffordable, this problem is just gonna grow and grow and grow. And that's gonna have other problems because most people that have a buy now, pay later loan debt, they also have other types of debt like credit cards, mortgages, and they might be actively taking on new forms of legitimate traditional debt. Yet the people making those loans to them might see somebody who on paper looks eminently qualified for something, yet that very same person could be financially underwater and no one could know. Which could mean that just like during the 2008 housing crisis, loans are made to people who should not be getting them, and there's really no way to tell. Or there is a way to tell, but nobody's taking it seriously because it hasn't become a problem yet. Now there's a lot of pushback on this because the companies that make these buy now, pay later loans, they say everything's fine, it's all good, there's no problem, and they say there's a built-in safeguard, which is that if you stop making your payments, you are barred from continuing to use the service. But critics point out that you can still go get a loan from another buy now, pay later company because they don't really share information with each other, and this could be setting the world up for disaster. On top of that, many of the people who rely on these are vulnerable users. Their rent's already too high. The groceries here in New York are already too high. These are the folks that are at risk of not being able to pay anymore. It's not their fault. That's just the system that we have in front of us. Which could mean that the entire economy right now is on life support and nobody even knows. Especially since many of the folks who might find themselves stuck in a buy now, pay later trap didn't get there on purpose. And here's how the trap gets sprung. Most people don't understand that their financial situation is untenable until it already is. So what happens? Their rent goes up, then they have maybe a big expense that they need to pay for, and they say, okay, in order to get by for the next few weeks, I'm gonna do buy now, pay later on basic necessities, maybe things like groceries, whatever. But the costs on those go up. So now the buy now, pay later loans are too much, your living expenses are too much, and it's all because our leaders won't do the things that we need to not be in this situation. And everywhere in America right now, housing costs are through the roof, but nowhere is that happening faster and is more apparent than New York City. But the reason we aren't building enough apartments for people to live in as fast as we need to, or converting these empty offices as fast as we need to free up extra housing, it's because in this country there's another scheme going on which is probably even worse than buy now, pay later. And that scheme is called home ownership. Now, if you already own your home, good for you. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is the middle class path to wealth. And in a city like New York, especially, if someone buys something here, it's gonna cost almost everything they have because rent costs almost everything somebody has. And what do you think the worst thing to happen to a person in New York who just spent millions of dollars on an apartment? It would be for that place to go down in value. That would be a nightmare for that person, which means some people are against the idea of affordable housing because it would devalue the thing that they just bought and paid for. And there's really no way around it. Because even if you take a massive office building like this and you convert the whole thing into apartment rentals, which aren't even for sale, doing that's just like building a whole bunch of new affordable places that people could buy because now the use cases for your property are less. And now whoever decides to buy your fancy new condo that used to cost millions of dollars can do less with it because they can't rent it out for the same price that they used to. And if the cost of renting becomes cheaper, the cost